This is HOA neighbor court. It started with a fence line and ended with a board meltdown. I am calling security right now. Karen pointed at a gate latch and screamed that it was a safety hazard and she would force a replacement. I stood there holding the latch in my hand, the metal still warm from the afternoon sun, and I could feel my jaw tighten. She had a portable folding sign stand wedged under one arm and her phone in the other hand, already dialing like she was summoning backup for a hostage situation. The fence behind us was brand new, the posts still showing fresh concrete at the base, and the contractor crew was 20 feet away loading tools into a truck. Nancy King, enforcement chair for the Canyon View Design Review Association here in Boise, Idaho, had just declared war over a gate that was not even finished yet. I work as a nurse in a busy clinic, and I take care of my disabled sibling at home. The last thing I need is someone threatening to tow my contractor truck and shut down a project that is already costing me more than I budgeted. Nancy did not care. She stood there in her blue blazer with the hood up, her chin-length black bob swaying as she jabbed her finger at the fence line. And she said it again louder. I am calling security right now. The gate latch I was holding was a standard residential model, the kind you see on 10,000 fences in this neighborhood, but she was treating it like I had installed a live grenade. I looked at the latch, then back at Nancy, and I asked her what exactly the safety hazard was. She snapped that it was not about safety, it was about compliance, and I had missed deadlines they never communicated, and now the entire project was under stop work review. That was the moment I realized this was not about a latch or a deadline, this was about control. Nancy wore a cheap plastic badge clipped to her blazer lapel, the kind you get at an office supply store, with her name and the title Rules Enforcement Chair printed in block letters. She tapped it with one finger like it was a shield. Smile, I am documenting this for the file, she said, and she raised her phone to take a photo of me standing there with the latch. I did not smile. The contractor foreman walked over and asked if we had a problem, and Nancy wheeled on him and told him his truck was parked in violation of the easement and she could have it towed within the hour. The foreman looked at me, then at Nancy, and he said he was parked exactly where the permit allowed. Nancy said there was no permit on file, and the board was going to issue fines starting tonight. I felt the situation tipping. The crew had been here for 2 days, and we were supposed to finish the gate installation by end of week. The fence itself was already up, running along the property line I had confirmed with the original survey from when I bought the house. Nancy claimed I was 6 inches over the setback, and the posts were an unapproved style. I had the survey in my truck, and I had photos of 3 other fences on the same street, with identical posts, but she was not interested in facts. She wanted compliance, and compliance meant whatever she said it meant that afternoon. The board will back me because they are afraid of me, she said, and she said it loud enough that the foreman and his crew all stopped loading tools and turned to watch. That line hung in the air. I filed it away. I had moved to Canyon View 2 years ago because the price was right and the neighborhood looked quiet. Boise was growing fast, and this development sat on the edge of the valley where the scrub hills started. The HOA was strict, but I figured if I kept my lawn neat and my paint fresh, I would be fine. I was wrong. The Canyon View Design Review Association treated every property like a crime scene waiting to happen. They had rules about fence height, fence color, fence style, post caps, gate hardware, and something called setback compliance that I did not fully understand until Nancy started citing it. The rules said any structure within 10 feet of an easement required advance board approval, but the portal where you were supposed to submit requests was broken half the time, and nobody responded to emails. I had submitted my fence plan 6 weeks ago and got no reply. I assumed silence meant approval. Nancy said silence meant nothing, and I should have followed up in person. The gate latch incident happened on a Wednesday in late September. The air was still warm, but the evenings were cooling off, and the smell of someone grilling burgers drifted across the street. Neighbors were outside watering lawns and walking dogs, and a couple of them slowed down to watch Nancy yelling. She loved an audience. I could see her posture shift, shoulders back, voice projecting like she was on stage. She turned to the nearest neighbor, a guy named Keith, who lived 3 houses down, and she told him this was what happens when people ignore the rules. Keith nodded politely, and kept walking his beagle. Nancy turned back to me and said the hearing was scheduled for next Tuesday, and I was required to attend, or the fines would double. I asked her what hearing. She said it was posted on the portal. I told her the portal had not sent me any notifications in 3 weeks and my login was broken. She said that was my problem, not hers, and the board was not responsible for technology failures. I could feel the frustration building in my chest, but I kept my voice level. I told her I had submitted the fence plan in August and I had proof. She said the plan I submitted was incomplete and missing the setback certification. I asked her what setback certification. She said it was a new requirement as of July and everyone was supposed to know. I asked where that requirement was published. She said it was in the amended bylaws. I asked where I could read the amended bylaws. She said they were available at the clubhouse during business hours. I had a shift at the clinic that afternoon and I could not leave. My sibling needed medications picked up and I had exactly 90 minutes to get home, handle that, and get back to the contractor crew before they left for the day. Nancy was eating into that window and she knew it. She folded her arms and said if I could not attend the hearing, I could submit a written statement, but the board was going to proceed with or without me. I told her I would be there. She smiled and said good, because she was personally recommending a $1,500 fine and a stop work order. The contractor foreman heard that, and he pulled me aside and said if the project got shut down, he could not guarantee his crew would come back. They had other jobs lined up, and this one was already dragging. I nodded like I was losing, because I wanted her to get comfortable. Nancy had no idea I had already ordered a third-party boundary inspection and a compliance report from an independent surveyor. It was scheduled for Friday, 2 days away, and the surveyor was a licensed professional who had worked with the city on easement disputes before. I had not mentioned it to Nancy because I wanted her to keep escalating. Every threat she made, every word she said in front of witnesses, was building my case. The foreman saw the look on my face, and he asked if I was okay. I told him to finish the gate and ignore her. He hesitated, then nodded. Nancy was still standing there tapping on her phone. She looked up and said she was filing an incident report and copying the management company. I asked her if the management company knew she was threatening to tow a contractor truck with no warning. She said the truck was in violation and the association had the right to enforce parking rules. I asked her to show me the rule. She said it was in the covenant section 12. I asked if she had a copy of the covenants on her. She said I should have my own copy. I told her I did, and section 12 said nothing about contractor parking. She said I was reading it wrong. That exchange happened in front of Keith, who had circled back with his dog, and another neighbor, a woman named Sandra, who recorded HOA meetings on her phone and sent the files to a neighborhood group chat. Sandra lived 2 streets over, and she hated Nancy almost as much as I was starting to. She walked up and asked Nancy if this was about the fence or about something else. Nancy told her to mind her own business. Sandra said the neighborhood had the right to know if the board was selectively enforcing rules. Nancy said there was no selective enforcement, and if Sandra had complaints, she could file them in writing. Sandra said she already had. Nancy ignored her and walked toward the clubhouse, dragging her folding sign stand behind her like a piece of performance art. I watched her go and I felt a small flicker of hope. Sandra caught my eye and mouthed good luck. The foreman finished loading the truck and told me he would be back Friday morning to install the gate hardware, but if Nancy showed up again, he was calling his lawyer. I told him I understood. He drove off and I was left standing in my driveway with the latch still in my hand and the fence half done. The posts were set, the panels were up, but the gate was propped against the side of the house and the latch was uninstalled. Nancy had managed to turn a routine upgrade into a crisis, and the clock was ticking. If you are enjoying this HOA nightmare, please hit subscribe and drop a like so I know to keep bringing you these stories. I went inside and called the management company. The receptionist put me through to a compliance coordinator named Derek, who sounded tired before I even started talking. I explained the situation, and he sighed and said Nancy had filed 6 incident reports that week alone, and the company was drowning in her paperwork. I asked if the board had actually approved a stop work order. He said no. I asked if they had the authority to tow a contractor truck. He said not without a formal violation notice and a cure period. I asked if I had received a formal violation notice. He said he would check and call me back. I hung up and looked at the fence. It was clean, professional, and exactly like a dozen others on my street. The posts were pressure-treated pine with flat caps. The panels were 6 feet tall, and the gate was a simple swing design with a standard latch. There was nothing unusual about it, except that it was mine and Nancy had decided it was her hill to die on. I pulled out the survey I had gotten when I bought the house and I spread it on the kitchen table. The property line was marked in red ink, and my fence was 2 inches inside it. If anything, I was being conservative. But Nancy claimed the setback rule required 3 feet from the easement edge, and the easement edge was somewhere between the property line and the street. I had no idea where the easement edge was because the HOA had never provided a map. That was the gap Nancy was exploiting. The rules referenced setbacks and easements, but the definitions were vague and the maps were not available. You were supposed to know where your easement was, but if you asked the HOA, they told you to check the county records. And if you checked the county records, they told you to ask the HOA. It was a perfect loop of blame. I decided to break the loop. I called the independent surveyor and asked if he could move the inspection up to Thursday. He said he could do Thursday afternoon if I paid a rush fee. I paid it. That night, I got a call from Derek at the management company. He confirmed that no formal violation notice had been issued, and Nancy did not have the authority to order a stop work or a tow. He said I could proceed with the project, but he recommended I attend the Tuesday hearing because Nancy was pushing for a board vote on new enforcement policies, and she wanted my fence to be the test case. I asked what the new policies were. He said Nancy wanted the board to authorize immediate fines for any project that started without explicit written approval, and she wanted the authority to issue stop work orders on her own without board review. I asked if the board was likely to approve that. He said 2 of the 5 board members were afraid of Nancy, and 1 was her friend. The other 2 were skeptical but non-committal. It could go either way. I thanked him and hung up. The stakes were higher than I thought. If Nancy got her new enforcement powers, she would turn the neighborhood into a police state. Every mailbox, every garden bed, every paint touch-up would require her approval, and she would use that power to settle personal grudges and control people. I had seen her do it before. Last spring, she had forced a neighbor to remove a bird feeder because it was not on the approved structures list. And 2 months ago, she had threatened another neighbor with a lien over a lawn ornament that was supposedly too reflective. The neighborhood was getting tired of her, but nobody wanted to be the one to challenge her directly. I was about to become that person whether I wanted to or not. Thursday afternoon, the surveyor arrived. His name was Tom, and he wore a neon vest and carried a tripod and a laser level. He spent 90 minutes walking my property line, taking measurements, checking the fence posts, and comparing everything to the county records and the original plat. I stood in the driveway and watched. Nancy drove by twice, slowing down each time to glare, but she did not stop. When Tom finished, he came over and showed me his notes. The fence was fully compliant. The posts were 18 inches inside the property line, the setback requirement was 2 feet from the easement edge, and the easement edge was at the curb. I had more than 4 feet of clearance. Nancy had been wrong about everything. Tom printed a compliance report on the spot and handed it to me. It included photos, measurements, and a legal description of the property boundaries. He said if the HOA tried to challenge it, he would testify that the fence met all county and HOA setback requirements based on the recorded easement. I asked him if he had ever dealt with Canyon View before. He said he had done 3 surveys in the neighborhood, and every time the HOA had backed down once they saw his report. He said most HOA boards do not want to fight a licensed surveyor in court because it makes them look incompetent and opens them up to liability. I felt a weight lift. I had my trump card. I was not going to show it to Nancy yet. I wanted her to keep digging. The hearing was Tuesday, and I planned to let her present her case first, let her commit to her version of the rules, and then I would pull out the compliance report and watch her face when she realized she had been wrong from the start. The report also included a section on selective enforcement. Tom had noted that 3 other fences on my street had identical setbacks and post styles, and none of them had been cited for violations. That was evidence of favoritism, and it was exactly the kind of thing that could force the management company to audit the entire enforcement process. Friday morning, the contractor crew came back and finished the gate. The latch went on smooth, and the gate swung perfectly. The foreman tested it 3 times and said it was code compliant and safer than half the gates in the neighborhood. I paid him the final invoice, and he left. I stood in the backyard and looked at the fence, and I felt proud. It was clean, professional, and exactly what I had planned. Nancy could scream all she wanted. The fence was staying. That afternoon, I got another call from Derek. He said Nancy had filed a motion to hold an emergency board meeting on Saturday to issue an immediate stop work and levy fines before the Tuesday hearing. I asked if that was legal. He said the bylaws allowed emergency meetings if a majority of the board agreed there was an urgent threat to property values or safety. I asked if a completed fence counted as an urgent threat. He said Nancy was claiming the fence was a liability risk and a code violation, and the board had a duty to act. I asked if the board had agreed to the meeting. He said 3 members had agreed, which was enough for a quorum. The meeting was set for Saturday at 10 in the morning at the clubhouse. I called Sandra and told her what was happening. She said she would be there with her phone recording. I called Keith, and he said he would come as a witness. I printed 3 copies of the compliance report, and I put them in a folder with the original survey and photos of the other fences on the street. I was ready. Saturday morning, I woke up early and I felt calm. I had the evidence, I had witnesses, and I had the rules on my side. Nancy had overplayed her hand, and she was about to find out. I drove to the clubhouse and parked in the front lot. The clubhouse was a low brick building with a covered walkway and a row of wooden benches outside. Nancy was already there, standing near the entrance with her folding sign stand and her plastic badge. She saw me, and she smiled. "Smile, I am documenting this for the file," she said. And she took another photo of me getting out of my truck. I walked past her without responding. Inside, the board was setting up folding chairs in a meeting room. The president was a retired engineer named Bill, who looked uncomfortable. The vice president was a woman named Claire, who was Nancy's friend. And the other 2 members were a young couple named Josh and Linda, who seemed overwhelmed. Derek from the management company was sitting in the back with a laptop. Sandra came in right behind me and sat in the second row with her phone already recording. Keith arrived a minute later and stood near the door. Nancy walked in and took a seat at the front table like she was a board member. Bill cleared his throat and said the meeting was called to order. He said Nancy had requested an emergency session to address a fence compliance issue, and the board was going to hear her case and make a decision. Nancy stood up and launched into a presentation. She had printed photos of my fence, a diagram of the property line, and a list of alleged violations. She said I had installed a fence without approval, I had violated the setback requirement, I had used unapproved materials, and I had ignored multiple warnings. I let her talk. She went on for 10 minutes, citing rules and sections and subsections, and she pulled out a copy of the bylaws and read from section 12. She said the covenant was clear, and I was in violation. She said the board had a duty to enforce the rules equally, and if they let me get away with this fence, every homeowner in the neighborhood would start ignoring the rules. She said the board had to act now, or they would lose control. Bill asked if anyone else wanted to speak. I raised my hand. I stood up and walked to the front. I put the folder on the table and I opened it. I pulled out the compliance report and I handed a copy to Bill, one to Claire and one to Derek. I said I had hired a licensed surveyor to inspect the fence and confirm compliance. The room went quiet. Nancy leaned forward and tried to see the report. I said the survey showed the fence was fully compliant with all setback requirements, the posts were inside the property line, and the easement clearance was more than double the required distance. I said the fence style was identical to 3 other fences on the same street, none of which had been cited for violations. I said that was evidence of selective enforcement. Nancy stood up and said the report was irrelevant because I had not submitted it during the approval process. I said there was no approval process because the board never responded to my submission. Derek spoke up and confirmed that the portal had been malfunctioning, and multiple homeowners had complained about missing responses. Nancy said that was not the board's fault, and I should have followed up in person. I said I had emailed the board twice and called the management company 3 times. Derek confirmed that he had records of my calls. Bill asked Nancy if she had any response to the compliance report. Nancy said the surveyor was wrong, and the board should get a second opinion. I said I would be happy to have the county review the survey, and I would also be happy to submit a formal complaint about selective enforcement if the board wanted to go that route. Claire asked what I meant by selective enforcement. I pulled out the photos of the other fences and I passed them around. I said all 3 fences had the same posts, the same setbacks, and the same gate style, and none of them had been cited. I asked Nancy why those fences were acceptable and mine was not. Nancy did not answer. She looked at Claire and then at Bill, and she said the board needed to trust her judgment. Bill said he appreciated her work, but he could not ignore a professional survey. Josh asked if the survey was certified. I said it was, and the surveyor was willing to testify if needed. Linda asked if the other fences had been approved. Derek checked his records and said one had been approved in writing, one had been grandfathered in before the current rules, and one had no record at all. Nancy said that proved her point. The neighborhood was out of control, and the board needed to crack down. Bill said it proved the enforcement was inconsistent, and the board needed to fix that, not make it worse. The vote was quick. Bill said he was not comfortable issuing a stop work order or a fine based on the evidence. Josh and Linda agreed. Claire voted to support Nancy. The motion failed 3-2. Nancy stood up and said the board was making a mistake, and she would file a formal objection. Bill said she was welcome to do that, but the meeting was over. Nancy grabbed her folding sign stand and walked out. Sandra was grinning. Keith gave me a thumbs up. I walked outside, and Nancy was standing near the walkway. She pointed at me and said this was not over. I said I had the survey, and I had witnesses, and if she wanted to keep fighting, I would file a harassment complaint with the management company and the state HOA ombudsman. She said I was bluffing. I said I was not, and I pulled out my phone and showed her the email I had already drafted to the ombudsman. Her face went red. Smile. I am documenting this for the file, she said, but her voice was shaky. I walked to my truck and drove home. That afternoon, I got a call from Derek. He said the board had voted to suspend Nancy's enforcement authority pending a review of her cases. He said the management company was going to audit every violation she had issued in the past year and check for selective enforcement. He said if they found a pattern, they would recommend the board remove her from the enforcement chair position and implement a new approval process with oversight. I asked how long that would take. He said 2 to 3 weeks. I thanked him. Sunday was quiet. Monday I worked a long shift at the clinic and came home exhausted. Tuesday morning I woke up and remembered the original hearing was still on the calendar. I called Derek and asked if it was canceled. He said Nancy had not withdrawn her complaint, so the hearing was technically still scheduled, but the board was not planning to take any action because the emergency meeting had already resolved the issue. He said I could show up if I wanted to make a statement, but it was not required. I decided to go anyway. I wanted to close the loop. The hearing was at 7 in the evening at the clubhouse exterior walkway. Board members and a few neighbors gathered outside because the meeting room was being used for another event. Nancy was there with her folding sign stand and her plastic badge. She looked tired. Bill started the meeting and asked Nancy to present her case. She said everything she had said on Saturday. I let her finish. Then Bill asked if I wanted to respond. I said I had already provided a professional compliance report and the board had voted. I said I was happy to answer questions, but I did not have anything new to add. Nancy said the board had made a mistake and the rules were being ignored. Sandra stood up and said the rules were being selectively enforced and Nancy was the problem. Keith said he had lived in the neighborhood for 8 years and he had never seen this kind of harassment over a fence. Another neighbor, a man I did not know, said his fence had been approved with the same setback and he had no issues. Nancy said they were all missing the point. Bill said the point was the fence was compliant and the board had voted. He said the hearing was over. Nancy did not move. She stood there holding her sign stand and she said the board would regret this. Bill said if she had further objections, she could submit them in writing. Nancy said she would, and she would also be running for board president in the next election. Claire said she supported Nancy. Josh said he did not. Linda said the board needed to focus on fixing the process, not fighting with homeowners. Bill adjourned the meeting. As people started to leave, Nancy walked up to me and said I had made an enemy. I said I had followed the rules and she had not. She said the board would back her eventually because they were afraid of her. I said that was the problem, and I pulled out my phone and played back a recording I had made on Saturday when she said the exact same thing in front of Keith and Sandra. Her eyes went wide. I said if she kept harassing me, I would submit the recording to the management company and file a formal intimidation complaint. She said I was bluffing again. I said I had already sent the recording to Derek and he had confirmed it was admissible. She turned and walked away. 2 weeks later, Derek called and said the audit was complete. The management company had found 12 cases where Nancy had issued violations for issues that were identical to other properties she had ignored. 3 homeowners had submitted formal complaints. The board voted to remove Nancy from the enforcement chair position and implement a new process where all violations had to be reviewed by the management company before fines or notices were issued. Nancy resigned from the board entirely the next day. Claire tried to defend her, but the other board members voted to accept the resignation. I heard through Sandra that Nancy tried to rally support for a recall election, but nobody signed her petition. The neighborhood was done with her. The new enforcement process was slower but fairer, and the board started posting clear maps of easements and setbacks on the website so homeowners could check before starting projects. The portal got fixed, and the management company hired a part-time compliance coordinator who actually responded to emails. My fence stayed up. The gate worked perfectly. I installed a motion sensor light on the back corner post, and Nancy never came near my property again. A month later, I saw her at the grocery store, and she looked right through me like I did not exist. I was fine with that. The neighborhood settled down. Sandra kept recording meetings and posting summaries in the group chat, and a few people started running for board positions who actually wanted to help instead of control. Keith and I became friends, and we started a tradition of grilling on weekends in my backyard near the fence. The disabled sibling I take care of loved sitting outside in the evenings, and the new fence gave us privacy and peace. One evening in late October, I was outside checking the gate latch, and I heard a car pull up. It was Tom, the surveyor. He said he had another job in the neighborhood, and he wanted to see how the fence was holding up. I showed him the gate, and he said it looked great. He said he had done 2 more surveys for Canyon View homeowners in the past month, and both times the HOA had backed off after seeing his reports. He said word was getting around that the board was no longer tolerating selective enforcement, and Nancy's departure had changed the culture. I thanked him for his help, and he said he was just doing his job, but he was glad it worked out. That night, I sat in the backyard with my sibling and we watched the sun go down behind the hills. The fence posts cast long shadows across the grass, and the gate latch gleamed in the last light. I thought about the whole ordeal, and I realized the key moment was not the survey or the hearing or the recording. It was when I decided to stop reacting and start building a case. Nancy had power because people were afraid to challenge her, and the moment someone did, her entire system collapsed. The following week, I attended the next board meeting. It was inside the meeting room this time, and the atmosphere was completely different. Bill opened with a report on the new enforcement process, and he thanked the homeowners who had submitted feedback. He said the board was committed to transparency and fairness, and he invited anyone with concerns to speak up. A few people asked questions about upcoming projects, and Bill answered them calmly. There was no yelling, no threats, no plastic badges. It felt like a normal community meeting. At the end, Bill mentioned that the board was looking for volunteers to serve on a new architectural review committee that would help streamline approvals. Sandra raised her hand and said she was interested. Keith said he would help too. I thought about it and I decided to volunteer. If I was going to live in this neighborhood, I wanted to be part of making it better. Bill said he would send out information, and we could meet in a few weeks to get organized. I walked home that night and I felt something I had not felt in months. I felt like I belonged. The fence was not just a boundary anymore. It was a symbol of standing up, of refusing to be bullied, of insisting that rules apply to everyone or they mean nothing. Nancy had tried to use the rules as a weapon, and in the end, the rules had turned against her. A week later, I was working in the backyard, and I saw a family moving into the house 2 doors down. They had a truck full of furniture and a couple of kids running around. I walked over and introduced myself. The dad said his name was Marcus, and he had heard about the HOA drama from the realtor. He asked if it was really as bad as people said. I told him it used to be, but it was getting better. I told him about the new enforcement process, and I gave him Derek's contact info at the management company. Marcus said he appreciated it, and he asked about the fence. I told him the whole story. He laughed and said he was planning to put in a new deck, and he was worried about running into the same problems. I told him to get a survey, submit the plans early, and keep records of everything. He said he would. His wife came over and introduced herself as Angela, and she asked if there was a neighborhood group chat. I told her Sandra ran one, and I would ask her to add them. Angela said they were excited to be here, and they hoped the neighborhood was as friendly as it looked. I said it was getting there. That weekend I hosted a small barbecue in the backyard. Keith came, Sandra came, Marcus and Angela came with their kids, and a few other neighbors I had met during the fence ordeal showed up. We grilled burgers and hot dogs, and someone brought a cooler full of drinks. The kids played near the fence, and the adults sat in lawn chairs and talked about normal things like work and sports and weekend plans. Nobody mentioned the HOA, nobody mentioned Nancy. It was just a group of neighbors hanging out and enjoying a nice evening. At one point, Sandra pulled me aside and said she had heard Nancy was trying to get elected to the board of another HOA in a development across town. I said good luck to them. Sandra said she hoped they had better lawyers. We both laughed. Keith came over and said he was thinking about running for the Canyon View Board in the next election. He said he wanted to make sure the new process stuck and the neighborhood did not slide back into the old habits. I said I would vote for him. Sandra said she would campaign for him. Keith looked surprised and pleased. As the evening wound down and people started heading home, I stood by the fence and looked at the gate. The latch was solid, the hinges were smooth, and the whole structure was level and square. It was exactly what I had planned, and it had survived a war. I felt proud of that. I also felt proud of the fact that I had not backed down, I had not cut corners, and I had not let Nancy turn me into someone angry and bitter. I had fought back with facts and patience, and a willingness to outlast her. The next morning, I got an email from Derek. He said the board had officially adopted the new enforcement policies, and they were going to be published in the next newsletter. He said the management company was also implementing a homeowner bill of rights that outlined due process protections and limits on fines and penalties. He said it was the first time Canyon View had anything like that, and it was a direct result of the complaints and audits that followed my case. He thanked me for pushing back, and he said he hoped other homeowners would follow my example. I forwarded the email to Sandra, and Keith and I suggested we meet to talk about the Architectural Review Committee. Sandra replied within minutes and said she was free Thursday evening. Keith said he could do Thursday. I set up a meeting at my house, and I planned to have coffee and snacks ready. It felt good to be part of something constructive instead of just reacting to threats. Thursday evening, Sandra and Keith came over, and we sat in the backyard near the fence. I had printed copies of the new enforcement policies and the Homeowner Bill of Rights, and we went through them line by line. Sandra had a lot of ideas about how to make the approval process faster and more transparent. Keith wanted to make sure there were checks on board authority, so no single person could abuse the system again. I wanted to make sure homeowners had access to clear information and real support when they had questions. We talked for 2 hours, and we drafted a proposal for the Architectural Review Committee. The main points were, all submissions would be reviewed within 2 weeks, all denials would include written reasons and an appeal process, all rules would be available online with visual examples, and all enforcement decisions would require approval from at least 2 board members. We also proposed a quarterly homeowner forum where people could ask questions and raise concerns without fear of retaliation. Sandra said she would present the proposal at the next board meeting. Keith said he would back her up. I said I would help recruit volunteers for the committee. We all agreed it was a solid plan. As Sandra and Keith left, Keith said he felt optimistic for the first time in years. Sandra said she felt like the neighborhood was finally waking up. I said I felt like we had a chance to build something good. A week later, the board meeting happened, and Sandra presented the proposal. Bill said it was exactly what the neighborhood needed. Claire was gone. She had resigned along with Nancy, and the board now had 2 open seats. Bill said they would hold a special election in December to fill the seats, and he encouraged anyone interested to run. Josh and Linda both said they supported the proposal, and they wanted to see it implemented as soon as possible. The board voted unanimously to adopt it. That night I got a text from Marcus asking if I was running for the board. I said I was thinking about it. He said I should, and he would vote for me. I said I would decide by the end of the week. Sandra texted and said she was running and she hoped I would run with her. Keith texted and said he was running and he wanted us to be a team. I thought about it overnight and I decided to do it. I had fought this hard to fix the system, I might as well help run it. The election was in early December. Sandra, Keith, and I all ran as a slate with a platform focused on transparency, fairness, and community engagement. We put flyers in mailboxes, we posted in the group chat, and we went door to door talking to neighbors. Nancy tried to run a counter-campaign supporting 2 candidates who promised to restore strict enforcement, but nobody wanted to go back to that. The vote was decisive. Sandra, Keith, and I all won. Nancy's candidates lost badly. The first board meeting with the new members was in January. Bill was still president, and he welcomed us and said he was excited to work with people who cared about the neighborhood instead of controlling it. We got to work immediately. The Architectural Review Committee was up and running by the end of the month. The homeowner forum was scheduled for February. The new enforcement policies were working, and complaints were down. One evening in late January, I was outside checking the fence, and I noticed the latch was starting to show a little wear. I took it off and I replaced it with a new one, same style, same finish. As I tightened the screws, I thought about how much had changed in 4 months. The fence was the same, the neighborhood was the same, but the people running it were different, and the culture was different. Nancy was gone, her system was gone, and the neighborhood was building something better. I got a call from Tom, the surveyor, a few days later. He said he had another client in Canyon View, and the approval had gone through in less than a week. He said whatever we were doing on the board, it was working. I thanked him and I told him we were just trying to make the process fair and transparent. He said that was all anyone wanted, and most HOAs never figured that out. I said we were lucky we had a wake-up call before things got worse. He said a lot of neighborhoods were not that lucky. In February, the homeowner forum happened, and over 50 people showed up. Bill opened the meeting, and he invited questions and feedback. People asked about landscaping rules, parking policies, holiday decorations, and pool hours. Every question got a clear answer, and nobody got yelled at. At the end, a woman named Rita stood up and said she had lived in Canyon View for 15 years, and this was the first time she felt like the board actually cared about homeowners. The room applauded. Sandra teared up. Keith smiled. I felt a lump in my throat. After the forum, Marcus came up to me and said his deck approval had just been granted, and the process was smooth. He said he appreciated the help I had given him, and he wanted to join the Architectural Review Committee. I said we would love to have him. Angela came over and said the neighborhood felt different than when they moved in, and she was glad they picked this place. I said it was a team effort and everyone was pitching in. That night I drove home, and I sat in my backyard, and I looked at the fence one more time. It was just a fence. 6 feet tall, pressure-treated pine, flat caps, simple gate with a standard latch. But it had become a line in the sand, a test of whether rules meant anything, and a catalyst for change. I had built it to give my sibling and me some privacy and peace. It had given the neighborhood a lot more than that. The following month, the board voted to publish a new homeowner handbook with clear guidelines, maps, and contact information. Sandra led the project, and she did an amazing job. The handbook included a section on dispute resolution that outlined how to file complaints, how to appeal decisions, and how to request mediation. It also included a code of conduct for board members that prohibited intimidation, retaliation, and selective enforcement. Bill said it was the most professional document Canyon View had ever produced. The management company printed copies and mailed them to every household. Spring came and the neighborhood started to bloom. People were outside again, working on gardens and planning upgrades. I saw more new faces at the homeowner forum in March, and the questions were constructive instead of fearful. The Architectural Review Committee approved a dozen projects in the first quarter, and every approval included a written confirmation and a timeline. Nobody got blindsided. Nobody got threatened. The system was working. One afternoon in April, I was working in the front yard, and I saw a for sale sign go up at Nancy's old house. She had moved out quietly over the winter, and nobody seemed to miss her. The house sold fast to a young couple with a baby. They moved in a few weeks later, and I went over to introduce myself. The husband said his name was Ryan, and he had heard about the HOA reforms from the realtor. He said it was one of the reasons they chose Canyon View. I told him we were all working hard to keep it that way. He said he appreciated it, and he asked if there was anything he could do to help. I told him to come to the next homeowner forum and get involved. He said he would. That summer, the neighborhood had a block party in the park near the clubhouse. It was the first time Canyon View had done anything like that in years. The board sponsored it, and we set up grills and tables and a bounce house for the kids. Over 100 people came. There was music and food and games, and for a few hours it felt like a real community, instead of a collection of houses monitored by a rules committee. At one point during the party, Keith pulled me aside and said he had just heard that Nancy had joined the board of the HOA across town, and within 3 months they had voted her out after multiple complaints. He said she was now threatening to sue them. I said that was her pattern and it would probably follow her everywhere. Keith said some people never learn. Sandra came over and said she had just gotten a message from Derek at the management company. He said Canyon View was now being used as a case study by the Regional HOA Association for how to reform enforcement practices. He said other neighborhoods were asking for copies of our policies and handbook. Sandra said she was proud of what we had built. I said I was too. As the sun set and the party wound down, I walked back to my house and I stood in the backyard by the fence. The latch clicked softly as I tested the gate. The posts were solid, the panels were straight. Everything was exactly as it should be. I thought about the cold afternoon in September when Nancy had screamed at me over this same fence, and I thought about how far we had all come since then. The fence had not changed. The neighborhood had. I hope you are doing well.